In my last video, I discussed moral objectivism versus moral relativism, and in it I mentioned cognitive relativism, the extension of this theory about the subjective nature of truth. I keep coming back to that, and I think that's probably going to be the theme for these videos to come. In that case, my friend and I could not agree on whether or not morality could be objectively defined for people, and this is one of the reasons I started this channel. I'm fascinated with the ways in which people disagree, and how fundamental differences in basic premises can result in wildly different worldviews. In this instance, my friend and I had unquestioned assumptions about the nature of morality, and as a result, we could not seem to agree on theories of violence and nonviolence. I often have arguments just like this with my own mother, and I want to analyze one of my most recent ones. Today I'm going to talk about innate intelligence and why attempts to measure and categorize human intelligence are suspect at best and doomed to fail at worst. You see, my mom believes that there's a genetic component to intelligence, and that there's a difference in average intelligence across races. As we argued, it became apparent that we weren't disagreeing because of misinformation and misunderstandings. We had differences in assumptions about some very basic truths. In this video, I will unpack ideas about human intelligence, culture, and genetics, and how our unconscious perceptions of these affect our identities and beliefs. The reason I'm making this video and videos like these is to organize information so that it can be easily used. I found this information useful in discussion with others, and again, I'm going to attach the transcript of this video with the works cited in the description if anybody else wants to use it. The main question in this essay is whether there is a relationship between intelligence and genetics, and if so, what kind? To begin, I offer this working definition of intelligence, the ability to acquire knowledge and skills. For this discussion, it's obvious I'm referring to human intelligence, but since this video is about questioning underlying assumptions, I want to give some context to human understandings of intelligence. We also put it into context of animal intelligence and our attempts to measure and categorize it, and also ourselves and human intelligence within it. There's also machine intelligence, which humans have designed using human intelligence, but which should surpass human intelligence if it arguably has not already. Now, if you consider human intelligence in the context of all life on Earth, it's hard to resist putting ourselves at the top. I think this might explain some of the tendencies to force intelligence into a linear, hierarchical scale. However, animal intelligence shows us how intelligence develops across species as they adapt to different problems. The innate abilities of a lion can't be compared against the innate abilities of an orca. They are developed by and for different environments. And if you look at intelligence in the context of machine learning and artificial intelligence, biological factors can be likened to hardware and our life experiences to software. Humans, like machines, have a range of memory, efficient and inefficient means of storing, recalling, and interpreting data. By synthesizing these two perspectives, we have our concept of intelligence, something that develops in response to an environment, and something that can be measured and improved upon. Now that we have a working definition of intelligence, how can we test it? This is the first critique of IQ tests, the fallacy of testing. By nature, a test is simulated. It can't be substituted for a real-world application. The imperfections of testing methods can create a gap between the test taker's aptitude and their assessment. For example, when I was in the 3rd grade, I took my first multiple-choice test. Although I knew the material on the quiz, I had never taken a multiple-choice test, and I was confused about how I was supposed to fit my entire answer into the tiny blank space provided. I had never learned that I was supposed to pick the corresponding letter A, B, C, or D for the answer I wanted. Even though I could demonstrate ability in the subject being tested, an imperfect testing method would not show that. When people talk about cultural bias in testing, they usually mean something like this: some assumptions about testing that preclude the actual ability being tested. This could be the language of the test, common knowledge that is actually culturally specific, or the expected answer format. But suppose you could design a test that controlled for these biases. Could you manage to test someone's future ability? Well, in the early 1900s, French psychologist Alfred Binet tried to do just that when he developed the basis for what would become the first IQ test. He designed the test to specifically assess a child's ability to perform in school and what placement they should have within that school. He would later caution the use of his scale for measuring intelligence, warning that 1. The test should not be used to judge innate intelligence or used to label people permanently. and 2, that the test was unable to test for some critical types of intelligences, like emotion or creativity. Unfortunately, these warnings were not heeded, and people started using and redesigning his test for all sorts of purposes. The context of this conversation is important because the ideas of race and IQ did not develop separately. Early adopters and supporters of IQ tests intended to use it to justify racial distinctions and hierarchies. American psychologist Lewis Terman can be credited for injecting these ideas into American thought and culture at a time when Americans were highly concerned with the role of new immigrants in society. Terman was also a eugenicist. This field of study continued throughout the 20th century with Arthur Jensen and the bell curve, and the results were usually used to justify anti-immigration and segregation policies. I don't have time in this video to talk about the anthropological history of race and IQ, but there's a long, complicated story there, trust me. Instead, let's go over Binet's warnings. Number 1, that the test should not be used to judge innate intelligence or to label people permanently. The idea of innate intelligence is a paradox. The concept of innate ability requires that ability exists in the individual already. Those who believe in intelligence is an innate ability are arguing that there's a genetic basis for intelligence, a combination of genes related to the development of the brain that result in naturally smarter people. In other words, one could not study for an IQ test. If an intelligence test were advanced enough, it would be able to identify intelligence before it was ever presented or manifested. We would only test infants, ideally as close to conception as possible, to prevent any other variables from affecting the outcome. In fact, if a test were truly perfect, we would need nothing but DNA to determine the total intellectual capability of a human. But we cannot do such a thing, because even if we could determine through genetics the predicted shape and size and structure of their brain, it wouldn't account for the development of a brain, and the brain's development has a huge effect on intelligence. There are parts of our anatomy that are encoded into DNA, but a large part of the brain is created during infancy, childhood, and adolescence by cultural and environmental factors. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to change throughout a human's life, and it can result in differences in gray matter and stronger or weaker synapse signals. Although it decreases over time, human brains retain this plasticity until death, meaning there is no static level of intelligence. According to the study Reopening Windows, Manipulating Critical Periods for Brain Development, the brain acquires certain skills, from visual perception to language during critical windows, specific times in early life when the brain is actively shaped by environmental input. Scientists are now discovering pathways in animal models through which these windows might be reopened in adults and thus reawakening a brain's youth-like plasticity. If innate ability can be influenced by environmental factors and intelligence can be improved upon throughout a human's lifetime, it logically follows that we should not categorize people based on intelligence permanently. Since that one is pretty simple, let's move on to his next point, that the test was unable to test for some critical types of intelligence like emotion or creativity. Binet thought IQ tests failed to accurately assess emotional and creative intelligence, which brings up 2 questions. 1, how can we define, much less assess, something as subjective as emotion or creativity? And 2, what other types of intelligence might IQ tests fail to assess? Gardner's theory of intelligence positions 9 types, which are naturalist, musical, logical, mathematical, existential, interpersonal, kinesthetic, verbal linguistic, intrapersonal, and spatial. Here we start to see just how impossible the idea of an intelligence test is. How can humans define, prioritize, and quantify these and potentially other types of intelligence, and then design a tool that assesses them without bias? This is my second critique of the assumptions about IQ testing. I do well on tests now that I've learned the multiple choice strategy. But that's not because I'm a genius in every category. Rather, being above average in the verbal linguistic category enabled me to exploit a flaw in the testing design. That tests are administered through reading and writing, or less often, through speaking and listening, and rarely in any other format. I'm not saying that verbal linguistic intelligence isn't the most important type of intelligence, but the norms of a testing assume that it is, and the test scores reflect that. I would like to think that my area ability is the most important, but that's because I'm biased. I can't think of a rational reason it trumps interpersonal skills or the capacity for self-reflection or logical reasoning. The reason I embarked on this topic was to understand why my mother believes in the merit of IQ tests, and why I don't. And while I can never be certain, I have one strong hypothesis. Intelligence is a part of her identity, and that makes it uncomfortable to question. You see, if you believe in intelligence as something innate, then that means it doesn't require effort to attain or maintain. If intelligence is something that can be improved or neglected, then all of a sudden, she becomes accountable for her intelligence. And that can be scary. Part of the reason I started questioning the legitimacy of these kinds of tests and intelligence in general is my experience transferring high schools. I attended one high school in Texas and another in Louisiana, but they were vastly different in terms of measured achievement. I was a good student in Texas, but I was struggling to even crack the competitive top 10% of students in terms of grades and scores. But at my Louisiana high school, my scores were the highest. Even at 16, the argument that this difference could be explained by some sort of regional genetic makeup wasn't convincing. In fact, I shared more in common culturally and genetically with my Acadian school. So I began questioning, why were the environments so different? Could the differences in scores be explained by innate ability? Are students in Texas naturally smarter than students in Louisiana? The answer is, of course, no. While genetics play a part in innate abilities, these effects can be traced to a variety of more influential cultural and environmental factors. Nutrition affects childhood development, and inadequate nutrition can lead to delayed mental and motor functioning. The same is true for immunity, and sickness and injuries in children have more effects on physical and mental development. The average education and income of parents is a larger predictor of the child's success in school, and even differences like learning 100 extra vocabulary words before kindergarten can significantly affect a child's educational outcome. But perhaps the most obvious explanation for the differences is one of educational policy. In Texas, public schools receive at least $5,140 per student. In Louisiana, it's $3,961. Average cost of living cannot explain a difference of more than 20%. By the time a Texas student graduates, their state has invested an extra $15,000 into each student, and it isn't a stretch to imply that that translates into a measurable difference in scores. So, I've laid out a pretty clear case for the paradox of innate ability and why that calls for an intense skepticism of IQ tests. However, I still need to address the final, most contentious point. Do IQ tests prove a significant difference in intelligence between races? Even if we decide that intelligence can be measured accurately and objectively, even if we assume that intelligence can be quantified and organized along a linear scale, does this prove that any race is less intelligent on average than another? I'm still going to answer no. The tests and data we currently have cannot isolate the genetics. It's simply impossible. The human brain is plastic, and the rate of development for the first 2.5 decades is so environmentally dependent that no one can claim to have the answer. Even if we just look at a human brain as an organ and try to make sense of the anatomical and physiological differences across peoples, we still don't have a definitive answer. For example, there are differences in brain size across race on average, but brain size does not correspond directly to intelligence. The ratio of brain size to body size can be a better formula to understand cognitive ability, but this still doesn't mean that two people with the same brain size but different body weights will necessarily have those corresponding abilities. The differences in the physiological structures of the brain are also still being studied. For example, a study on the variability in frontotemporal brain structure found that the African American population exhibited smaller total cerebral volume than Caucasians, although there were no statistically significant differences in total gray matter, total white matter, or ventricular volumes. The only statistically significant difference was that African Americans exhibited larger left orbitofrontal cortex volumes than Caucasians. The African American cohort exhibited greater ratios for the right amygdala and bilaterally for the orbitofrontal cortex. In this study, the African American subjects on average had a larger amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex, the parts responsible for processing emotions and decision making. Now, this study was limited by a small sample size, and I'm not claiming differences in neurological structures translate directly into overall intelligence. In fact, I've been arguing for the opposite for pretty much this whole video. It makes more sense to me that intelligence is more than the sum of its parts, that we cannot categorize it into a hierarchy nor pinpoint it to an exact quantity. In conclusion, IQ is a simplistic misrepresentation of the much more complicated concept of human intelligence. Even if a perfect test were designed that could represent each human's innate ability, it wouldn't look like a single number. It would probably be a general range of ability in a multitude of different areas that fluctuates over time.